I got more than just words. I got more than just words. You bring me songs sweet like the birds. So I got more than just words.
Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the history of Valentine's Day. So come along and join us. You like that? You do.
Before we get rolling, if you'd like to support the work that I do here, be sure to visit my merchandise store below, which has a lot of my unique designs about my channel. Use the offer code Valentine for an extra 15% off through February 14th. You can find the links in the video description below. In researching the history of St. Valentine's Day, there are many stories and variations on where it originated from, all rooted in the distant past. In one version, it was described that in the Middle Ages, the tradition of choosing a romantic partner on that particular saint's day began because it was believed that birds began mating on that day. However, there are those that dispute this, citing lack of evidence from the period that St. Valentine, an early Christian martyred by the Romans, that he had any connection whatever to do with birds or romance. In an article published in 1960 in the Battle Creek Inquirer and News, it reads, "The whole idea began about 1,000 years ago when Valentine's Day was strictly a token of friendship sent to commemorate the kindly spirit of Saint Valentine, a young Roman priest executed February 14th, 270 AD for refusing to renounce Christianity." In the 1800s, stories abounded that the roots of St. Valentine's Day reached back to Rome and the festival of Lupercalia on the 15th of February. But some modern scholars tend to discount that idea. Lupercalia was a pagan holiday, unlike Valentine's Day as we know it today. It was a bloody, violent, and sexually charged celebration with animal sacrifice, random matchmaking, and coupling in the hopes of warding off evil spirits and infertility. So basically, picture a scene from the movie Animal House, with just a lot more goats running around. At the end of the 5th century, the pagan festival was deemed unchristian by Pope Gelasius, who declared that February 14th would be St. Valentine's Day as an official holiday. Basically, you guys over there put your clothes back on and start handing out cards, flowers, and chocolate instead. Well, maybe not quite that way. But basically the idea is that the Catholic Church stepped in and changed the holiday to a different day, gave it a different meaning to replace this pagan celebration. Another version of the story was published in 1962 in the Battle Creek Inquirer and News, which reads, "The whole thing began in the year 271 AD when a young Roman priest, Valentine, was beheaded for refusing to denounce Christianity. While in prison, legend has it, he wrote a farewell message to his jailer's blind daughter who had befriended him and signed it, 'From your Valentine.' From this account, we would have to assume that someone read the message to her, which would bring a third person in on the secret message. Or perhaps someone intercepted the message and never read it to her. Either way, someone else read Valentine's message, because after all, the young lady was blind. Following this, the telling of Valentine sending the message, the article describes, in honor of the young martyr, Roman bachelors began to send Valentines to their chosen ladies, and the idea caught on, spreading all over the world. So despite the holiday's mysterious and somewhat puzzling origins, people have observed St. Valentine's Days for many centuries. An article written in the Inquirer News by Bernice Lowe in 1971, she's the author of Tales of Battle Creek, she described how in 1476 a poem appeared telling how a game of choosing Valentines was played in the homes of English gentry. She describes before this that St. Valentine's Day was established in France and Italy before making its way into England. The writing of special notes and letters for Valentines gained widespread popularity in the 1700s. At that time, romantic missives would have been handwritten on ordinary paper. Papers made especially for Valentine greetings began to be marketed in the 1820s, and their use became fashionable both in Britain and the United States. In the 1840s, when postal rates in Britain became standardized, commercially produced Valentine's cards began to grow into popularity. The cards were flat paper sheets, often printed with colored illustrations and embossed borders. The sheets, when folded, would then be sealed with wax and mailed. According to legend, it was an English Valentine received by a woman in Massachusetts that inspired the beginnings of the American Valentine industry. Esther A. Howland, a student at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, began making Valentine's cards in 1849 after receiving a card produced by an English company. As her father was a stationer, she sold her cards in his store. According to Bernice Lowe, she was originally trying to just outdo the English samples that she'd seen. Her father, seeing her work, believed that she actually had done this. She then convinced her brother, who traveled for her father's business, to take the samples with him. He returned with orders totaling $5,000. Now remember, this is in the 1850s. Knowing it would take her years to make that many Valentines, she asked friends to help her, and soon she had a manufacturing establishment going. The business grew, adding die cuts for pictures, and eventually her hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts, became the center of American Valentine production. Her business reached $100,000 per year before she sold the company to a local firm. In Battle Creek in the 1800s, local bookstores advertised the availability of Valentines in their stores, often competing against each other in the same paper. Here's a few examples. In the mid-1850s, the sending of manufactured Valentine's Day cards was popular enough that the New York Times published an editorial on February 14, 1856, sharply criticizing the practice. They wrote, "Our beaux and belles are satisfied with a few miserable lines neatly written upon fine paper, or else they purchase a printed Valentine with verses ready-made, some of which are costly and many of which are cheap and indecent. In any case, whether decent or indecent, they only please the silly and give the vicious an opportunity to develop their propensities and place them anonymously before the comparatively virtuous. The custom with us has no useful feature, and the sooner it is abolished, the better." Despite the outrage from the editorial writer, the practice of sending Valentines continued to flourish throughout the mid-1800s. In the years following the Civil War, newspaper reports indicated that the practice of sending Valentines was actually growing. On February 4th, 1867, the New York Times interviewed Mr. J. H. Hallett, who was identified as the superintendent of the carrier department of the city post office. Mr. Hallett provided statistics which stated that in the year 1862, post offices in New York City had accepted 21,260 Valentines for delivery. The following next year showing a slight increase, but then in 1864 the number had dropped to only 15,924. Now remember, the Civil War ran from 1861 to 1865. A huge change occurred in 1865. Perhaps the dark years of the Civil War were ending. New Yorkers mailed more than 66,000 Valentines in 1865 and more than 86,000 in 1866. The tradition of sending Valentines was turning into a big business. The February 1867 article in the New York Times reveals that some New Yorkers paid exorbitant prices for Valentines. They wrote, "It puzzles many to understand how one of these trifles can be gotten in such shape as to sell for $100. But the fact is that even this figure is not by any means the limit of their price. There is a tradition that one of the Broadway dealers, not many years ago, disposed of no less than 7 Valentines, which cost $500 each. And it may be safely asserted that if any individual was so simple as to wish to expend 10 times that sum upon one of these missives, some enterprising manufacturer would find a way to accommodate them. The newspaper explained that the most expensive Valentines actually held hidden treasures inside the paper. Valentines of this class are not simply combinations of paper gorgeously gilded, carefully embossed, and elaborately laced. To be sure, they show paper lovers seated in paper grottos under paper roses, ambushed by paper cupids, and indulging in the luxury of paper kisses. But they also show something more attractive than these paper delights to the overjoyed receiver. Receptacles cunningly prepared may hide watches or other jewelry, and of course, there is no limit to the lengths in which wealthy and foolish lovers may go. In the late 1860s, most Valentines were modestly priced and targeted towards a mass audience. Many were designed for the humorous effect, with caricatures of particular professions or people. Indeed, many Valentines in the late 1800s were intended as jokes, and the sending of humorous cards was a fad for many years. The comic Valentine was incredibly popular between 1880 through World War I. Printed in color on cheap paper, it was usually a caricature with a sarcastic caption. These were often sent anonymously, often by a jealous man to a rival. One example of this was given in an article in 1960, which delivered the heartwarming message from a woodcut that a man might send in that era, and it read like this: "You shouldn't hold your head too high. You're not such a famous guy. You only think of pride and self, and you ought to go drown yourself." Simple, direct, and very charming, don't you think? These types of Valentines are often referred to as vinegar Valentines or penny dreadfuls. Anything but sentimental because of their sarcastic humor, these comic Valentines were often signed, guess who? In fact, in the early part of the 20th century, the Chicago Post Office rejected nearly 25,000 Valentines as inappropriate to be carried through the U.S. mail, as in those days they were often just open paper or merely folded over before envelopes were introduced, and anyone, including the carrier, could read them. Since those days, however, comic Valentines have kind of evolved from the sharp and sarcastic to more clever and humorous. The legendary British illustrator of children's books, Kate Greenaway, designed Valentines in the late 1800s, which were enormously popular. Her Valentine designs sold so well for the card publisher Marcus Ward that she was encouraged to design cards for other holidays. Some of Greenaway's illustrations for Valentine's cards were collected in a book published in 1876 called The Quiver of Love, a Collection of Valentines. By some account, the practice of sending Valentine cards fell off in the late 1800s, but eventually revived in the 1920s. But the holiday as we know it today firmly has its roots in the early 1800s. In looking through advertisements over the decades for Valentines, it's often an interesting study. In the later 1800s, you see mostly one or two line entries from a few local bookstores like these, making known that Valentines are for sale. If you're lucky, they mention a price or two. Still, you can see that the ones writing the newspapers during this time period were catering towards a male readership. Here's one entry published in the Nightly Moon in 1884 that reads, "The Moon reporters will feel slighted if they do not receive at least a dozen comic Valentines from persons who thus seek to get even with the paper. They make excellent kindlings." This one paragraph that was published on February 12, 1887 reads, "Purchase your Valentines for next Monday. Your girl will hardly expect you to remember her, and this will be an excellent opportunity to show your estimation of her." I'll just let that one sit there for a minute. Guys, try to think of using that as a pickup line the next time you go out to the bar. "Hey lady, this is my estimation of you." Don't think that's going to work too well. All right, moving forward in time to the period of the 1900s to the 1920s, we start to see some block advertising and more details competing for the Valentine business. Here's some examples, and there's actually some others that are quite hilarious. For example, look at this one from 1909, which reads, "Remember your friends with up-to-date Valentines. Don't send the old styles your grandmother used to receive." It then goes on to describe high-class comics, not the vulgar kind. So I know you're going to ask, what would they call the vulgar content? I asked that myself. Also, do you wonder what comics they would consider vulgar? I mean, on a scale from Red Skelton, which was really not vulgar, to say the extremes of Richard Pryor and George Carlin with the 7 words you can't say on television routine, where do these comics fit in on the vulgar scale when looking at the context of that time period? Also, when you place an ad saying your Valentines are not vulgar, are you not also subtly implying that your competition is? That's pretty shrewd, I think. But let's move on. Bernice Lowe describes Valentine's boxes in schoolrooms came into vogue around the turn of the century, when it was discovered that a few girls received many Valentines and others received none at all. It became the practice to draw names a week or so in advance so that every child could receive at least one Valentine. As we approach the 1920s, the ads in the newspapers get bigger, and some are whole pages devoted to Valentine's Day showing up. In 1922, there was this very interesting ad, which would seem to be a bit premature, and it ran just before Valentine's Day by the Baker Drug Company that read, "To the first baby born on St. Valentine's Day, we will give," and it lists out all these items. Now, the fact that this ad was among a whole page of other ads that ran on February 10th, 1922 in the Battle Creek Moon Journal, all of them rewarding the first baby born on Valentine's Day, giving them everything from baby food to jumpers and records. Now, if you ask me, 4 days is not merely enough time for those who wanted to compete for those prizes, if you get what I'm saying here. But what's very funny about it is during this period of time, every year there seemed to be rewards for the baby born on Valentine's Day, which is kind of interesting. It was also more noticeable that ads for flowers started to show up in the 1920s, whereas before I didn't see any when I was doing my research. By the 1930s, there are articles about traditions, and in 1936 there was one devoted to showing the lacy Valentines were in vogue that year. However, this ad in the St. Philip's News featuring a naked cherub might have been considered a little bit vulgar a few decades earlier. In the 1940s, there were comic Valentines being drawn at the Pinochle Club meetings and parties at Ann J. Kellogg School. These kind of events were with all sorts of clubs were common in the 1940s. In 1941, we have a Valentine being mentioned for sale between sections advertising extra large panties, 25 cents, and roast turkey dinner in the same ad by Dollar Day Values.
Fascinating is a word I use for the unexpected.
I'm scared half to death.
In 1942, there were ads running in the Fort Custer News for Valentines there for the soldiers. In 1949, there was a couple of interesting musings published about Valentine's Day here. In the 1950s, the newspapers featured consistently pictures of children on their Valentine's Day publications, and these kids were creating Valentines, posing for photos, and even the occasional smooch. In the 1960s, the traditions were continued with children, and even Charlie Brown had his heart broken in this one, where he pines for the little redhead girl to mail him a Valentine, but instead gets a smooch from Snoopy as he opens the mailbox. But seriously, look at this ad that ran in 1969. Just look at the prices on those chocolates. Those were the days. In the 1970s, some of Norman Rockwell's drawings were featured at the Battle Creek Civic Arts Center around Valentine's Day. Also, look at the personal ads that were featured during that decade called Heartlines in the Inquirer and News. Kids, this is what we did before Instagram and TikTok. In 1989, you could take your love out for a quarter-pound hamburger for less than $2 on Valentine's Day. But you had better make a reservation. Or maybe you went for that dinner for two deal when you bought a Maytag washer and then went to the movies afterwards. You know, people used to do that before streaming movies on their couch. Remember how sticky those movie theaters used to become after a Rocky Horror Picture Show? Yeah, now you know why they needed a Maytag. Of course, the heart lines changed to love lines in the 1980s and continued on into the 1990s. Does anyone else miss print newspapers for some of these things? It brings back some memories for me, I tell you what. In 1993, there was a fun article about the Coburn elementary students sharing Valentines with veterans at the VA Medical Center. How cool is that? As for the 2000s and forward, Valentine's Day is still at its core a very personal and sentimental holiday, and people usually send beautiful cards, often which include hearts, roses, and poetic verses. This still carries on even today, but it's also a day that evolved to be a large industry for flowers, candies, and gifts, and restaurants are often booked for romantic dinners. Often this holiday of romance and love is used as a day for proposals of marriage and celebration. Perhaps today people do not spend as much time creating or mailing cards as they used to before, but there's no reason the tradition can't be revitalized.
Well, that's going to do it for today's journey through the history of Valentine's Day and traditions. I hope you enjoyed it. Mocha and I had a great time researching this story. So if you liked today's video, please take a minute, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with others. And happy Valentine's Day.
Farewell and adieu to your Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu to your ladies of Spain. For we've received orders to sail for old England, but we hope in a short time to see you again. We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar like true hearts of oak, until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushat to Scilly is 35 leagues.